The spring of 2017 came into Trego County the way it always had, slow and dry, the wind carrying the smell of last year's stubble and the faint metallic tang of the alkali flats that ran east of the old Hensarling place. The county had been auctioning off orphan parcels for 3 days by the time they got to parcel 147, and most of the folks who'd come for the real land, the quarter sections with good bottom soil and working wells, had already loaded up their pickups and driven home. What was left in the shade of the courthouse oak was a thin crowd of retirees, a few speculators from Hayes, and one tall, lean man in a faded canvas jacket who stood a little apart from the rest, with his hands folded behind his back. Wendell Orbison McKay was 62 years old that April, and he had the long, careful look of a man who had spent most of his life watching wheat come up. He had been born 4 miles from where he was standing, had served 22 years in the Army before coming home to take over his father's ground, and had farmed the same 320 acres ever since. He did not speak much at auctions. He did not speak much anywhere, really, not since Daphne had passed. But he had driven in that morning because there was one parcel on the list that he had been thinking about for a long time, and he wanted to see what it would go for. Elmer McKinley Swope, the auctioneer, was 70 years old and had been calling sales in Trego County since Lyndon Johnson was in the White House. He had a voice like a cedar fence post, weathered, honest, a little cracked in the upper register, and he worked the list without hurrying. When he got to parcel 147, he paused, pushed his glasses up his nose, and squinted at the description. 12 acres, he said. Hensarling Saltland Flat, Section 17. No improvements. No, well, that'll draw anything you'd want to drink. Starting bid is $5, folks, and I'll take $5 to get us moving. Nobody moved. Somebody in the back coughed. A meadowlark was singing somewhere out past the parking lot. 3 clear notes, and then the warble. And for a long second, that was the only sound in the courtyard. Elmer waited the way he always waited, patient as a sundial. And then he said, $5. Anybody. It's 12 acres of Kansas dirt, even if it is the wrong kind. Wendell cleared his throat and raised one finger about waist high. 8, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the way quiet voices do when everybody else is still. Harold Horseman Vey was standing by the courthouse steps with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops, and when he heard the bid he actually laughed out loud. Harold was 58, ran a 4,000-acre corporate spread on the north side of the county, and had made it his habit for 30 years to tell anybody who would listen that Wendell was the last of the stubborn men, which in Harold's mouth was not a compliment. He laughed, and then he said loud enough for the whole yard to hear, $8, Wendell? Good Lord, man, I'd pay you 10 just to keep it off my tax rolls. A few people chuckled. Wendell did not turn his head. Elmer gave the crowd one more look, let the silence stretch the way a good auctioneer will, and then brought his gavel down on the lectern with a soft, dry tap. Sold, he said. $8, Mr. Orbison McKay. Congratulations, Wendell. May the Lord have mercy on your back. There was a little ripple of laughter, good-natured mostly, and then the auction moved on to parcel 148. Wendell walked over to the clerk's table, signed the paper, counted out 8 $1 bills from a worn leather wallet, and put the receipt in the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. On the way back to his truck, Harold fell in beside him, grinning under his gray mustache, and said, "Wendell, I swear to you, partner, I have seen men do a lot of strange things at a county auction in my time, but buying that salt flat takes the biscuit. What in the world are you going to do with it?" Wendell did not stop walking. He did not look sideways. He just said, in the same quiet voice, "I'm going to try something, Harold." And he got in his truck and drove home. The land itself had been left alone for so long that the prairie grass around its edges did not even bother to come up onto it anymore. It sat in a shallow basin between two low rises, 12 acres of pale gray crust that shone faintly white in the spring sun, the way old snow shines when it's gone crystalline. The soil underneath, where the crust broke and you could get at it, was the color of ash and smelled faintly of soda, and when a man stepped on it wrong, his boot would sink an inch and come up tacky, as though the earth had been mixed with weak glue. The trouble had started in 1957, which most people in Trego County could still tell you about if you asked, because it was one of those small local catastrophes that families pass down like a recipe for how not to do things. Old man Henserlin had drilled an irrigation well that year, right in the middle of a stretch of ground his father had broken out of native sod in 1912, and the well had come in strong and steady and perfectly salty. The water tested at over 4,000 parts per million of dissolved solids, most of it sodium chloride and sodium sulfate, and Henserling, being the kind of man who believed that a well that ran was better than a well that didn't, had pumped it onto his wheat for 6 straight seasons before he finally gave up. By 1963, the ground would not grow anything but kochia and the occasional salt-tolerant thistle, and by 1970, it was bare. By the time the county finally repossessed the parcel in 2009 for unpaid taxes, nobody in the neighborhood could even remember when the last green thing had grown on it. It was the kind of land that a farmer drove past without looking at, because looking at it made a person feel a particular kind of sadness. It was not the sadness of ground that had been used up honestly, the way a field can get tired after 100 years of wheat. It was the sadness of ground that had been poisoned, that had tried in the patient way that soil tries, and had simply been asked to drink something it could not drink. There were places out on that flat where you could see the ghost lines of the old irrigation laterals, low ridges where the tractor had thrown dirt up on either side of a furrow, and the ridges were whiter than the ground around them, as though the salt had wicked up into them and crystallized there and stayed. Wendell knew all of this. He had grown up 4 miles from it. As a boy, he had ridden his bicycle past it on the way to the one-room schoolhouse at Wakini Corners, and his father had told him the story of the well, and his father's voice when he told it had been the quiet, disappointed voice of a man who had watched a neighbor make a mistake he could not take back. Wendell had remembered that voice all his life. He had remembered it in the Army, standing in places much farther from home than a salt flat in western Kansas, and he had remembered it the first time he brought Daphne out to show her the country she was going to live in. He had driven her past the Henserling Flat on a Sunday afternoon in 1979, the summer before they were married, and she had looked out the passenger window of his Ford and said, "Oh, Wendell, the poor ground." He had not forgotten that either. Daphne Orbison had been a school teacher's daughter from Salina, a small, bright woman with a laugh that carried across a room and a habit of reading 3 books at once. She had come to Trego County to teach 4th grade at the Consolidated School in Wakini, and she had met Wendell at a church potluck the second month she was there. They were married 14 months later in the little Methodist chapel on 3rd Street, and she had moved out to the farm and made it a home in the quiet, practical way that good women make homes, one curtain and one jar of apple butter at a time. She had been the reader in the family. Wendell read the farm journal and the Bible and the occasional Louis L'Amour. But Daphne read everything, novels and poetry and history, and later, in the long winters after Cora Linnea left for college, books about farming that Wendell himself never would have picked up. She had brought home a copy of John Seymour's The Self-Sufficient Life and How to Live It one year, somewhere around 2005, and she had read passages out loud to him in the evenings while he patched harness in the shop, the way some wives will read the newspaper aloud to husbands whose hands are busy. One evening in late October, with the wind coming down hard out of the northwest and the first real cold of the year pressing against the kitchen windows, she had read him a passage about poisoned soil. Seymour had been writing about a piece of ground in Wales, alkaline and abused and written off by the neighbors, and he had described how a patient man with a plan and a few tons of the right amendment had brought it back inside of a decade. "It always comes back given a chance," Seymour had written. "The ground forgets nothing, but it forgives almost everything. It only asks for time and for somebody to care." Daphne had closed the book and looked at him over the top of her reading glasses, and she had said, "Wendell, you ought to try that flat someday, that poor old Henseling flat." He had laughed a little, not at her, never at her, and he had said, "Girl, that ground is dead." "Nothing's dead," she had said. "That's what the man's telling you." 3 years later, she was diagnosed. It was a kind of breast cancer that did not respond to the usual things, and it went through her the way a hard spring storm goes through a wheat field, fast and without consideration. She was gone by November of the following year. Cora Linnea came home for the funeral and stayed for 2 weeks. And when she went back to Manhattan to finish her doctoral work at Kansas State, Wendell was left in the farmhouse alone with the sound of the refrigerator and the wind. For 3 years he did what widowers do. He farmed his 320 acres the way he had always farmed them. He went to church on Sundays. He drove into Wakini on Tuesdays for coffee at the diner, and he did not talk very much about his wife because talking about her did not bring her back. He lost weight, and then he put some of it back on. He bought a border collie named Captain from a man in Ness County. He read the Bible through twice, and sometime in the winter of 2016, sitting by himself at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, he thought about Daphne's voice reading John Seymour, and he thought about the Henseling flat, and he thought about the fact that the county had been trying to get rid of that parcel at auction for 8 straight years, and nobody would touch it. The auction was in April. He bid $8, because $8 was what he had in his wallet in singles, and because a round number felt wrong, and because his wife had always said that the Lord had a way of arranging small specific sums when a thing was meant to happen. When he drove out to the flat that same evening, after signing the papers, he parked the truck on the county road and walked out onto the crust in his work boots. And he stood there for a long time with his hat in his hand. Then he knelt down, and he laid his palm flat on the pale gray ground, and he said very quietly, "I'll try it, girl. I don't know if I can, but I'll try it." The meadow lark was singing again somewhere out past the south fence. The wind was coming low across the flat and lifting thin curls of dust off the salt crust. Wendell stayed on one knee for what felt like a long while, and then he got up, slowly, the way a man his age gets up off hard ground, and he walked back to the truck. He did not cry. He had done his crying 3 years ago, but he drove home with the window down and the cold spring air on his face, and when he got to the farmhouse, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote, in the small square notebook he had kept by the telephone since 1986, one sentence: "Call Cora Linnea about the flat." Cora Linnea Trutwell. She had taken her husband's name when she married Peter Trutwell in 2011, but her father still sometimes called her Cora Linnea Orbison by accident on the phone, was 34 years old and a soil scientist with the agronomy department at Kansas State University. She had grown up on the farm, had ridden on her father's lap in the combine before she could read, and had gone to K-State fully intending to come home and farm alongside him until a freshman soils lab in Throckmorton Hall had shown her a thin section of calcic horizon under a polarizing microscope and rearranged her life. She had stayed for the doctorate, married a fellow graduate student, and taken a research position that kept her and Peter and their 2 small boys in Manhattan most of the year. She came home to Waukene on holidays and in the middle of August, when the wheat was long in the bin and her father had time to sit on the porch. When Wendell called her that week, she listened to him describe the purchase without saying a word. She could picture the flat perfectly. She had written a graduate seminar paper in 2008 on sodium-affected soils in the high plains, and the Hensarling parcel had been in her figures. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Daddy, that's going to be a lot of work." "I know it," he said. "That's sodic soil," she said, "not just saline. The sodium has broken down the structure. When you wet it, it disperses. The clay particles come unglued from each other, and the whole profile seals up like pottery. You can't just leach the salt out. You have to replace the sodium on the exchange sites before you do anything else." "All right," he said. "How do I do that?" There was another pause, and then he heard her get up and walk across the kitchen in Manhattan. He could tell because her voice moved, and then she said, "Okay, hold on. Let me get a pen." She called him back the next evening and the evening after that, and by the end of the week they had the outline of a plan. The first step, she told him, was gypsum, calcium sulfate, the soft white mineral that farmers had been using on sodic ground since the 1800s, because the calcium ion on the gypsum would push the sodium ion off the soil particles and let it be washed away. For 12 acres of a crust that bad, she said, he was looking at somewhere around 22 tons of agricultural gypsum, incorporated shallow, in 2 applications 6 months apart. That would cost him, at the price she was seeing from the supplier in Hayes, about $4,400. The second step was drainage. You could put all the gypsum in the world on a sodic flat, she said, but if the salt and sodium had nowhere to go when you flushed them out, you were just stirring the soup. He needed a French drain, a trench cut across the low end of the parcel, lined with filter cloth and filled with washed rock, with perforated pipe in the bottom of it, running to daylight in the ditch along the county road. That would give the winter snowmelt and any rain he could catch a place to carry the displaced salts off the ground. The third step was cover. Bare salt crust in western Kansas in January is a dead thing. You have to put living roots into it, and you have to do it with species tough enough to germinate in soil that would kill a corn plant. She recommended winter rye, broadcast at twice the normal seeding rate because half of it was not going to come up, and mixed in with daikon radish. The big white tillage radish that sends a taproot 2 or 3 feet down and punches holes through a hard pan like a drill bit. The rye would hold the soil together through the freeze. The radish would crack the subsoil open and, when it died back in winter, would leave long vertical channels for water and air and the next generation of roots. And the fourth step, she said, and here she paused because she knew her father, was patience. Daddy, this is not a 1-year project. This is not a 3-year project. You are going to put amendments on that ground, and you are going to wait. You are going to watch things fail. The first winter is going to look terrible. The second winter is going to look a little less terrible. You are not going to see wheat come off that ground for 4 years, maybe 5. Do you understand what I am telling you? Wendell was quiet for a moment, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of him, and Captain asleep on the rag rug by the stove. He thought about Daphne reading out loud in the evenings. He thought about the 8 singles he had counted out on the clerk's table. He thought about his own life, 62 years of it, and how quickly they had gone, and how slowly at the same time. "I understand, honey," he said. "I've got time." He ordered the gypsum in June. A semi-truck from the supplier in Hayes brought the first 11 tons in late July, and Wendell unloaded it with a skid steer and piled it under a tarp beside the machine shed, where it sat like a small white hill all through the hottest part of the summer. In August, he drove over to the flat with his old case tractor and a 3-point hitch spreader and put down the first application. Not broadcast the way you'd put down fertilizer, but worked shallow, with a set of disc harrows set at a very slight angle, so the gypsum got into the top 2 inches of crust without turning the whole profile over. It took him 4 days. The dust came up white around the tractor and settled on his jacket and on Captain, who rode in the cab the whole time. And when he came in the evenings to wash up, he was white to the elbows. In September, he started on the drain. The low end of the parcel was the southwest corner, where the land sloped maybe 2 feet in 100 toward the county road ditch, and that was where the trench had to go. He marked the line with survey flags, and he thought about hiring a trencher from the co-op. And then he thought about what it would cost, and he thought about the fact that he had all winter, and he decided to dig it by hand. He was 62, and in good shape for his age, and he had a good shovel, and he had Captain for company. He started the first Saturday in December with the ground hard but not yet frozen solid, and he worked on it every morning for 3 weeks. He would get to the flat at 7 o'clock with a thermos of coffee and a lunch that Daphne's old red lunch pail still carried, and he would dig until noon, and then he would eat his sandwich sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and look at what he had done. The trench was 4 feet deep and 14 inches wide, and he cut it 440 feet long across the southwest corner of the flat. He hit 3 old barbed wire fence posts buried in the subsoil, and an empty Prince Albert tobacco tin from probably 1940, and once, about halfway through the second week, a flat sandstone slab that somebody had set upright for reasons he could not guess. He left the sandstone where it was and dug around it. On the 18th day, it began to snow, and he finished the last 40 feet of the trench in the snow with his beard frosted white and Captain watching him from inside the truck cab. He laid the filter cloth in the bottom on the 19th day and the perforated pipe on the 20th, and he hauled 4 pickup loads of washed river rock from the gravel pit at Cedar Bluff on the 21st. When he was finished, he stood at the top of the trench and looked down the long line of it, and he took off his glove and laid his hand on the last back-filled stretch of ground, and he did not say anything at all for about 2 minutes. Then he broadcast the winter rye. He did it by hand, out of a canvas seed bag slung over his shoulder, walking the 12 acres in overlapping passes, the way his grandfather had broadcast oats in 1935. He put the daikon radish on 3 days later, lighter, out of a smaller bag, spacing it the way Cora Linnea had told him to. He seeded heavy, twice the normal rate on the rye, as she had said, and when he was done, he got in the truck and drove home and slept for 11 hours. The first winter was as bad as Cora Linnea had predicted. Most of the rye did not come up. The seed lay on the salt crust, and the January winds blew a good deal of it off the ground, and what stayed was hammered by a deep freeze that drove down past 20 below for a week in February. In March, when Wendell walked out onto the flat to look, there were long patches where nothing at all had germinated, and the patches where the rye had come were thin and yellow and no taller than his boot. He stood there in the cold spring wind with his hat pulled low and looked at the failure of his first year's work, and he thought for a long moment about giving up. Then he thought about Daphne. Then he got back in the truck. Spring came on. The daikon radish surprised him. It had come up in a scatter across the whole flat, not thick, but persistent, and where the big white taproots had gone down, they had cracked the crust open in little star bursts. The rye, where it had come, was beginning to green up too. By the end of April, the flat had a faint, irregular cast of new growth over about 40% of its area, and it was the first time living plants had covered that much of that ground since 1962. Wendell put on the second application of gypsum in May, worked it in shallow again, and overseeded with another heavy pass of winter rye in June. By midsummer, the rye was knee-high in patches, still sparse, but in the low spots where the drainage had begun to work. Where the winter melt had been able to carry some of the sodium down to the French drain and out into the ditch, the plants were actually dark green and healthy. He walked the flat once a week and kept a little notebook of what he saw. He wrote in July, southwest corner, rye 24 inches, heads forming, northeast 30 feet from fence, crust still bare. He wrote in August, radish regrowing from last year's taproots in maybe 20 places. Volunteer kochia down by half from last count. It was in August of that second year that Mr. Absalom Kweku Bentley first drove up to the fence. Absalom Kweku Bentley was 50 years old, the county extension agent for Trego and Gove counties, a tall, slim man with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and the faint, clean accent of a man who had grown up speaking 2 languages before he had ever spoken English. He had been born in Kumasi, in Ghana, had come to the United States at 17 on a scholarship to Iowa State, and had worked for the Cooperative Extension Service ever since. He had been in Trego County for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had learned the names of every farmer on his circuit and most of their wives, and he had made it his business to drive out at least once a quarter to every place on his list, whether the farmer had asked him to come or not. He pulled up to the Henseling flat that August afternoon in a white pickup with a county seal on the door, got out, and stood at the barbed wire fence with his hands on his hips and his head tilted slightly to one side, the way a man will when something does not match his expectation. Wendell was down in the middle of the flat, walking a transect with his notebook, and he saw the truck and straightened up. He walked back to the fence the way a man walks in no hurry. "Mr. Orbison McKay," Absalom said. "Good afternoon, sir." "Mr. Kweku Bentley," Wendell said. "Good afternoon." They shook hands across the top wire. Absalom turned and looked out over the flat for a long, quiet moment, at the irregular patches of green rye, at the scattered daikon coming back for a second year, at the long, dark line where the drain ran under the southwest corner. And then he looked back at Wendell, and he said, "Sir, will you forgive me for asking, but what is happening on this ground?" Wendell told him. He told him about the auction and the $8, about Daphne reading John Seymour in the evenings, about Cora Linnea's plan and the 22 tons of gypsum and the French drain he had dug by hand. He spoke without any particular emphasis, the way a farmer describes the weather, and when he was finished, Absalom Kweku Bentley was looking at him with an expression that Wendell could not immediately read. "Mr. Orbison McKay," Absalom said finally, "I would very much like your permission to take soil samples from this parcel 4 times a year at 6 locations for as long as you are doing what you are doing. I will not charge you for the analysis. I will share the data with you. I will publish nothing without your consent. Will you allow me this?" Wendell looked at him for a moment, and then he said, "Yes, sir. I'd be obliged for the information." Absalom took samples that very afternoon. He had a hand auger in the bed of his truck, and he pulled 6 cores from 6 points Wendell helped him mark with flags, and he labeled each core with a grease pencil on a paper bag and laid them in a crate in the cab. Before he drove away, he shook Wendell's hand again, and he held it a second longer than was strictly necessary, and he said quietly, "Sir, I have walked many acres of this kind of ground, in Ghana, in Iowa, here. I have never seen anybody do what you are doing on a parcel this bad. I am going to come back." He came back that November with the first sample results. The electrical conductivity of the top 6 inches of soil, which was the measure Cora Linnea had told her father to watch, had dropped from over 16 decicemens per meter, a reading that would kill nearly every crop plant known, to just over 9. The sodium adsorption ratio, which measured how thoroughly the soil particles were coated with sodium, had dropped from 38 to 23. "Mr. Orbison McKay," Absalom said, standing in the farmhouse kitchen with the paperwork spread out on the oilcloth and Captain asleep by the stove. "This is faster than the literature would have predicted. You are moving this ground." Wendell looked at the numbers. He did not fully understand all of them, but he understood that something in the poisoned dirt under his boots had begun, very slowly, to forgive. The 3rd year, Cora Linnea came home for Easter and sat with her father on the front porch drinking coffee, and when he told her what the numbers had done, she leaned back in the rocker and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Daddy, I think you need to start putting animals on it." She explained it to him the way she explained things to her freshmen, patient and slow. Grazing animals moved through small paddocks in a dense short pulse and then moved off, deposited nitrogen in the form that plants could use, stimulated grass growth by their hoof action and their saliva, and broke up surface crusts better than any tillage a man could do with a tractor. Mob grazing it was called, high stock density, short duration, long recovery, on a healing sodic soil where what was wanted most was biology and root mass and carbon. In the top 6 inches, nothing else would do the job as well. Borrow somebody's lambs, she said, 40 or 50 of them, set up electric fence, move them every day. Wendell had not run livestock in 20 years, but he still had the fence charger, and he still knew how to set polywire. He called an old neighbor named Vern Tuttle, who ran a small sheep operation south of Ransom, and Vern, who had known Wendell since 1968 and who did not ask a lot of questions, said he could spare 50 feeder lambs for the summer if Wendell would put the weight on them and split the gain. They made the deal over the phone in about 4 minutes. The lambs came out in a stock trailer in mid-May. Wendell built paddocks of about a 1/4 acre with polywire and step-in posts, and he moved the flock every morning before breakfast. And in the evenings, he sat on the tailgate of the truck and watched them graze. Captain, who had never worked sheep in his life, proved to be a surprisingly patient and natural hand at it, and the two of them, the old man and the old dog, moved that flock across the 12 acres all summer long. The lambs grazed the rye and the volunteer weeds and the first sparse stands of native grass that were beginning to come up on their own where the ground had opened. They fertilized where they went. They pressed the seed they stepped on down into contact with soil that, for the first time in 6 decades, could hold it. Absalom Kweku Bentley brought a researcher from Colorado State University out in July. Her name was Dr. Maren Odson Hallowell, and she was an ecologist who worked on range restoration, and she spent 2 full days walking the flat with a clipboard and a GPS unit. When she left, she shook Wendell's hand and said, "Sir, I would like to bring a graduate student back next summer, if you will have us." Wendell said that would be all right. In the 4th year, a young man drove up the county road in a dusty old Toyota pickup with California license plates and a camper shell held on with ratchet straps. He parked at the end of Wendell's driveway on a bright morning in early June, got out, and walked to the porch with his hat in his hands. He was 22 years old, slim, brown-skinned, with black hair cut short and a careful, polite face that reminded Wendell immediately of a soldier he had known in 1982. "Mr. Orbison McKay, sir?" the young man said. "My name is Jude de la Pena Suarez. I read about you in Mother Earth News. I drove out from Davis, California. I'm a junior at UC Davis in sustainable agriculture. I was wondering, sir, if I might work on your farm this summer for no pay. I brought my own camper. I can sleep in the yard." Wendell looked at him for a long moment. Jude did not look away. After a while, Wendell said, "Son, you drove 1,600 miles on the chance I'd say yes?" "Yes, sir." "Your folks know where you are?" "Yes, sir. My father is a nurse in Sacramento. My mother is a school principal. They raised me to follow the thing that made sense to me." Wendell thought about Daphne. He thought about Cora Linnea standing at his knee the first time he took her out in the wheat field. He said, "You can sleep in the yard if you want, but there's a guest room upstairs that's been empty 3 years. Come on in and I'll put some coffee on." Jude stayed the summer. He stayed the next summer, too. He took a semester off and then a year off, and then, in the fall of his 4th year with Wendell, he transferred the last of his UC Davis credits into Kansas State and finished his degree by correspondence while living at the farm. He did not go back to California. He learned to drive the old Case tractor, learned to set electric fence in a prairie wind, learned to read the weather the way a Trego County man reads it, by the high clouds and the way the cottonwoods turn their leaves. He was quick and careful, and he remembered everything. Wendell, who had never had a son, found himself one afternoon in the machine shed showing Jude how to adjust a chisel plow. And when he looked up and saw the young man listening with his whole attention, he thought to himself, "The Lord sends what he sends." Year 5 was the year of the first wheat harvest. Wendell and Jude had put a small test plot into winter wheat the previous fall. 3 acres in the heart of the flat, where the soil tests had come back most improved, planted to a hard red winter variety that had done well in county trials on marginal ground. The stand had come up thick in October. It had held through a hard winter. It had greened up early in March, and had jointed in April, and had headed in late May. And by the first week in June, the heads were heavy and gold and rattling dry when the wind ran through them. On a Thursday in late June, with the temperature at 94 and the sky cloudless, Wendell and Jude cut the 3 acres with Wendell's old John Deere combine. The grain went into the auger wagon, and from the wagon into the grain truck, and Wendell drove the truck into Waukene to the co-op that same afternoon. Captain rode shotgun. Miss Thelma Hartwell Pepys had been running the co-op for 22 years, which meant she had seen more trucks come through her scales than almost anybody in Trego County. She was 55 years old, a solid, pleasant woman with an iron-gray braid and an unshakable memory for numbers. And when Wendell pulled up to the scale that afternoon, she came out of the office in her denim apron and watched the grain probe come up out of the bin. She read the moisture. She read the test weight. She looked at the protein number. Then she looked at Wendell. And then she looked at the truck again. "Wendell Orbison McKay," she said. "Whose field did you get this wheat out of?" "Henseling Flat, Miss Thelma," he said. She looked at him for a moment as if he might be joking. When she realized he was not, she walked around to the back of the truck, and she opened the tailgate, and she reached in and pulled out a handful of the kernels, and she held them up to the sun. They were plump, deep red, clean. 15 bushels to the acre, she said. Wendell had already told her the yield on the way in. Test weight 62, protein 13.1. Wendell, this is good wheat. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Miss Thelma stood there for another moment, and then she went back into the office, and she came out with the ticket book. She wrote the ticket by hand. When she handed it to him, Wendell looked at the price, and he looked at her, and she said quietly, "I'm paying you 4 over market on this load, Wendell. Don't argue with me. I know where it came from." He did not argue. He put the ticket in the inside pocket of his canvas jacket, the same pocket where he had put the auction receipt 5 years before, and he drove home. On the way back out of town, he passed Harold Horseman Vay's pickup, going the other direction. Harold saw him. Harold did not wave. Harold did not stop. He looked straight ahead and drove on past. Wendell, who was not a man to hold a grudge, lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel anyway and drove home to supper. If you have walked with this story so far, and if you know someone in your own life who worked on something quiet for a long time before anybody noticed, let them come to mind for a moment. There is no hurry. In the 6th and 7th years, Wendell took the method he had built on the Hensarling Flat and carried it onto his own ground. His south quarter had a 20-acre patch along the creek that had gone sailing from a cattle lot his father had built in 1971 and torn down in 1985, but whose effects had persisted in the soil chemistry for decades. His north quarter had a low spot of about 15 acres that had never yielded well because of a high water table and poor drainage. Neither of them were as bad as the Hensarling Flat had been, but both of them were dragging on his farm's overall numbers, and both of them were the kind of problems that conventional wisdom said a man should just work around. He did not work around them. He put gypsum on the South 20 in the fall of the 6th year. He dug, or rather, he and Jude together dug, with a small trencher now that they had the equipment for it, a drain system through the North 15 the following spring. He seeded both patches to a cover mix that Cora Linnea and Dr. Odson Hallowell had helped him put together: winter rye and daikon for cover, cowpeas and sun hemp for nitrogen, a little buckwheat for the pollinators that were beginning to come back to the flat. He grazed the Tuttle lambs across all of it in the summers. He watched the numbers, and the numbers moved. In the middle of the 7th year, Jude de la Peña Suarez sat down with Wendell at the kitchen table one evening after supper and said, "Sir, I've been thinking about what comes next." Wendell put down his coffee. "I've been here 3.5 years," Jude said. "I don't intend to leave. I want to ask you, sir, what you would think about us becoming partners. I would bring what I have, which is not much. $12,000 I saved before I came, and my labor, and what I have learned from you. You would bring the ground. We would farm it together as equals. And when the time comes, however that time comes, I would continue the work." Wendell looked at him across the table for a long moment. Then he got up slowly, and he walked into the living room and came back with a small square notebook he kept by the telephone. He opened it to a fresh page. He wrote in pencil in his careful, blocky hand, "Orbison McKay and De La Peña Suarez, partners, 50-50, effective today." He signed it. He turned it around. Jude signed it too. Captain, who was getting old, thumped his tail once against the floorboards. Year 8 was the drought year. It began in a dry October, and it did not break until the next August. And by June, the eastern half of Trego County was burning up. The dryland wheat in most places had nothing under it, no subsoil moisture, no reserve, nothing to draw on when the surface dried out. Corn planted in April was rolled in yellow by the end of May. Even the native buffalo grass on the unbroken prairie was going dormant brown weeks ahead of schedule. Harold Horseman Vey's 4,000-acre corporate spread ran full tilt modern. Big center pivots where the Ogallala still gave water, high input dryland wheat, and corn on the rest. A rotation heavy on chemical fertilizer and tillage for weed control. When the rain stopped, Harold's ground had no carbon in it to hold what little moisture fell, and by harvest his wheat was going 8 bushels to the acre on some quarters. He told anybody who would listen that it was the worst year he had ever farmed. He told them it was a freak. He told them nobody could have done better. On the Hensarling Flat, and on the South 20, and on the North 15, and on Wendell's home quarter, where he and Jude had been building carbon for 3 years with cover crops and mob grazing, the story was different. The soil had structure now. The taproots of the daikon and the sun hemp had punched channels down into the subsoil that ran 15 and 20 and 30 inches deep, and water that fell in the rare thunderstorms that summer was soaking in and staying. The mycorrhizal fungi that had colonized the rebuilt flat, Dr. Odson Hallowell's graduate student, had been counting them for 2 years, were moving water from deep reserves up into the root zones of the crop plants. When Wendell and Jude cut the Henserling flat that August, it went 40 bushels to the acre, 40 bushels on a parcel that had been bare salt crust 8 years before. The whole home farm averaged 31 bushels that year. Harold Horseman Vey's spread averaged 9. In the 9th year, Wendell and Jude sat down with the state agronomist at K-State. Cora Linnea was in the room, too, and they made a decision. They would put the Henserling flat and the South 20 and 10 acres of the home quarter into Turkey Red. Turkey Red was the original hard red winter wheat that the Volga German immigrants had brought to Kansas in 1874. It was a heritage variety, tall and thin in the straw, lower yielding than modern cultivars, but with a depth of flavor and a baking quality that had made it legendary in its time. It had been almost entirely displaced from the commercial market by the 1960s, but a handful of mills and bakeries around the country were paying premium prices to the small number of farmers still willing to grow it. 3 of those bakeries were in Wichita, and when Wendell called them, all 3 said yes, before he finished asking. The Turkey Red came off the flat in July of the 9th year at 22 bushels to the acre. It was lower than the 40 they had gotten the year before in the drought, but the price was 3 times commercial, and the test weight and the protein were everything the bakers had hoped for. Miss Thelma Hartwell Pepys handled the sale through the co-op on paper for a commission she initially refused to take and which Wendell insisted on her keeping. One of the Wichita bakers drove up that August to meet Wendell in person and stood on the edge of the flat with his hands in his pockets and said, "Mr. Orbison McKay, I have been buying wheat in this state for 31 years. This is the best flour I have ever milled." In September of the 9th year, the Kansas Association of Conservation Districts named Wendell Orbison McKay and Jude de la Pena Suarez jointly the Kansas Conservation Partner of the Year. There was a ceremony in Topeka. Wendell wore his Sunday suit. Cora Linnea flew in from a conference in Minneapolis to be there. Absalom Kwaku Bentley drove up from Waukene. Dr. Odson Hallowell came from Fort Collins. Miss Thelma Hartwell Pepys drove from the co-op in her best blue dress. When Wendell stood at the podium to accept the plaque, he spoke for less than 90 seconds. He thanked the people in the room. He thanked his daughter. He thanked Jude, whom he called his partner and his friend. He thanked the memory of his wife. And then he said, "Folks, the ground does the work. I just showed up." He sat down to a standing ovation that lasted nearly a full minute, and if anybody in the room had been watching him closely, they would have seen him, sitting in his metal folding chair with the plaque in his lap, reach up very briefly and press the heel of his hand against his eye. It was 3 weeks after the ceremony, on a warm September evening, that Harold Horseman Vey drove his pickup up the farm lane and stopped at the gate. Wendell was on the porch, with Captain asleep by his feet and a cup of coffee going cool on the arm of the rocker. The sun was low in the west, throwing long gold light across the yard, and the cottonwoods down by the windbreak were turning the first of their leaves. He saw Harold's truck stop. He saw Harold sit in the cab for a long moment with his hands on the wheel. Then he saw him get out. Harold walked up the lane slowly, with his hat in his hands, which was not a way Wendell had ever seen him before. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He was 58, and he looked older. The skin under his eyes was loose, and his mustache had gone all the way gray, and he stood there for a moment without speaking. And then he said, "Wendell, Harold, I came to say something, and then I'll go. All right?" Harold looked down at his hat. He looked up at the sky. He looked back at Wendell, and his eyes were wet. "I laughed at you," he said, "at the courthouse in 2017. I laughed at you, and I said things around the county for years, and I was wrong. I was wrong about the ground. I was wrong about you. I don't know if I was wrong about the whole way I've been farming for 30 years, but it's starting to look like I was, and that's what I came to say." Wendell was quiet for a moment. He looked at Harold standing at the bottom of the steps, with his hat in his hand. He thought about the 8 singles he had counted out on the clerk's table almost 10 years before. He thought about Daphne reading John Seymour. He thought about Cora Linnea's patient voice on the telephone. He thought about Jude driving 1,600 miles in a Toyota pickup. He thought about Absalom Kweku Bentley standing at the fence with his head tilted slightly to one side. He thought about Miss Thelma weighing the first wheat and paying 4 over market. He thought about the meadowlark singing the evening he knelt on the salt crust. Then he said very quietly, "You want a cup of coffee, Harold?" Harold looked up. His face changed. For a moment he did not seem able to speak, and then he nodded, and he cleared his throat, and he said, "Yes, yes, Wendell, I'd like that." Wendell stood up. Captain stood up with him. They went inside together, the 3 of them, and Wendell put the kettle on the stove, the way Daphne had always put the kettle on the stove, and he got 2 cups down from the cupboard over the sink. And he and Harold sat at the kitchen table in the long, slow gold of a September evening in western Kansas, and drank coffee together for the first time in almost 40 years. They did not talk much. There was not a lot to say that both men did not already know. Harold asked after Cora Linnea. Wendell asked after Harold's grown son in Oklahoma. Harold said he had been thinking about trying gypsum on a bad corner of his north quarter, and he wondered if Wendell might come look at it sometime. Wendell said he would. When Harold stood up to leave, it was full dark outside, and the stars were coming out. He put his hat back on at the kitchen door, and he turned, and he said, "Wendell, how'd you know? How'd you know it would work?" Wendell thought about that for a long moment. He looked down at his own hands on the tabletop, hands that had dug a 440-foot trench in the snow, hands that had counted out 8 singles at a courthouse table, hands that had held his wife's hand the night she died. Then he looked up at Harold and he said, "I didn't know, Harold. I just trusted that it could." Harold nodded. He went out. The screen door closed behind him. His truck started in the yard, and the headlights came on, and he drove away down the county road toward home. And Wendell stood at the window and watched the tail lights go until they were gone. Then he walked out onto the porch again. Captain came with him. The stars were very thick and bright, the way they get over the high plains in September, and somewhere out past the windbreak, the coyotes were starting their evening song. Wendell sat down in the rocker. He put his hand on Captain's head. He looked east, toward the Henseling Flat, which he could not see from the porch, but which he could picture perfectly. 12 acres of deep, healthy soil now, 14 inches of black topsoil where there had been bare crust, a stand of heritage wheat stubble glowing faintly under the rising moon, the long, dark line of the drain running under the southwest corner, the meadowlarks asleep in the grass along the fences. People sometimes asked him what patience was in the years after all of this. They asked him because they thought a man who had done what he had done must know something they did not, and they expected him to say some long, slow thing about waiting. Wendell did not say things about waiting when he answered them at all, and often he did not because he was a quiet man. He would say that patience was not the same as waiting. Waiting, he would say, was what you did when you were hoping somebody else would fix something. Patience was what you did when you showed up every day and did the one small thing the day required and let the ground and the Lord and the years do what they did in their own time. He would say it was not a virtue exactly. It was closer to a kind of trust, a trust that the world under your boots was not finished, no matter how it looked, and that the thing you had loved and the thing you had lost and the thing you had been promised were all still held somewhere in the long memory of the soil. The ground forgets nothing, he would say, quoting a book his wife had once read to him in a kitchen full of the smell of late apples and wood smoke. The ground forgets nothing, but it forgives almost everything. It only asks for time and for somebody to care. The lights in the farmhouse were on. Jude was inside at the table, going over the winter planting plans on the laptop, and he would look up when Wendell came back in and ask if he wanted another cup of coffee, and Wendell would say yes. And the two of them would sit together at the table the way partners do and plan the 10th year and the 11th and whatever years the Lord decided to give. Out beyond the windbreak, past the county road, the Hensarling Flat lay quiet under the September stars. The wheat stubble whispered in the small, clean wind. The drain ran where it had been set to run and carried away what needed to be carried away. Somewhere deep in the rebuilt topsoil, where the taproots of 10,000 daikon radishes had once cracked open a crust of salt, the mycorrhizal threads were moving water up toward the sleeping roots of the cover crop that had been seeded 3 weeks before. The ground was doing its work. The old man had shown up, and that, in the end, was the whole of the story that Trego County had nearly not lived to see. The story of 12 acres of poisoned soil, and $8 bills in a canvas jacket pocket, and a woman reading in a kitchen a long time ago, and the long, patient love of a man who had believed her. The meadowlarks would sing again in the morning. They always did.